Hello and welcome to Captains of Industry. My name is Charles Bitonga. Now, if you had just $1 left, what would you spend it on? Bill Gates said he would spend it on public relations. And if you are like Gates, that dollar would most probably end up in the pocket of Gina Din-Kariuki, an entrepreneur who's come to shape PR in Kenya for 20 years now and counting. Take a look. Thank you so much. Now, you've been running Gina Din Group for 20 years.
But 20 years this month.
Yes. Take us back to 1997. PR in Kenya, was it there?
So it's really been a really interesting journey because PR, just worldwide is quite new on a standalone basis. I think PR was always an add-on to advertising agencies. So you can imagine 20 years ago in Kenya, PR was just basically non-existent. And a PR as a standalone, people thought I was absolutely crazy. So, it didn't exist. So I was really, going into uncharted waters. But I'm very glad that I did that because I think, not only was I building my own brand, but I was helping to build an industry, not just for Kenya, but on the African continent.
And so what is this that pushed you to that point? I mean, it was not an industry then. You had trained as a journalist. Why did you think that this would be a good way to go?
Well, I trained as a journalist, came back to Kenya, and really never practiced as a journalist because the media was quite closed then. So I joined Barclays and was the head of corporate affairs, for 14 years. But I saw then that there was a need, for somebody to do what I was doing for Barclays, but to be able to do that for other corporates. And everybody used to say to me, where can we find a Gina Din? Which then became like, oh, okay, well, this could be a thing. This could be a brand. So that's why.
And so I assume it was risky because if you look at then and looking at even where we've come from as a continent in terms of getting more women into business, leave alone starting their own businesses, I assume it was a big risk, but you can tell us more about that.
It was a huge risk. I mean, first of all, it was, as I said, uncharted territory. Nobody really knew. I mean, trying to explain PR even to my mom was really difficult. Like, what exactly do you do? So I think it was quite difficult just because people didn't know what it was. And it was really difficult being a woman, starting out a business in a field that nobody really understood. So was it, just going to events and holding, glasses of wine and not realizing that actually we were strategic communications consultants. And I think, when I look back now, I think, it was a good time to start because there really wasn't anybody like us. And so we've grown organically and we've been able to, get our team to global standards, and I think that's really, really important.
And let's talk about that team. I mean, where did you get people to do this with, or you're just doing it alone, looking at the fact that it wasn't an industry meant you couldn't find so many people to hire? Yeah,
so, training was, finding talent was, and actually continues to be quite a challenge. I mean, we're very lucky now that a lot more of the universities are offering PR degrees, but 20 years ago, you would only have to look at people and hire them based on what you assume was potential, and then train them. And we've trained, so many people. I mean, we have so many Gina Din people that are now working, in different organizations all over the world. And it just makes me proud that we've been able to add value and to, build capacity in the PR industry in this country.
And apart from running this organization, we've seen you rise to advising clients like Safaricom, big companies, being director at Enrin Energy. How have you positioned yourself for these opportunities? Because as we've been talking about getting women into business, that's one story, but getting to a board, becoming an advisor to a big company has not been always that easy for a lot of women.
I think it's, I think a lot of the organizations that have come into Kenya or have come onto the African continent, are part of PR companies worldwide. So, the PR company that they're with in New York will tend to follow them to wherever they are, whether it's Johannesburg or Lagos or whatever. And I think the problem with that is that, what the solution that you might have in New York will not work in Africa. So I think a lot of it is people are looking for local talent, local knowledge. And what we've done is we've been able to give local knowledge and local experience, but with global standards. Obviously, being a woman it's been really tough, and it's, but I think as a woman I'm quite assertive, and I just realized that I'm not going to be invited to the table, so I will come uninvited. I always call myself the best gatecrasher, and I'll just say, look, I'm here, this is what I can do for you. And, you know, over time, people have come to realize that there's nothing like experience, nothing like local experience.
Yeah. Let's get back to Gina Din Group. What really is your strategy? What do you look at? Have you seen a change of strategy from how you got business 20 years ago to how you're going about it now?
Absolutely, it's huge.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, 20 years ago, really, who was our audience would be like 4 newspapers.
Yeah.
Now you've got the whole of digital that has come on board, and the DNA and the culture of an organization has had to change.
Yeah.
And you have to be receptive to that. So, you know, we've been, and the ones who weren't receptive just haven't stood the test of time. Before, don't forget, if you had a complaint against an organization, you'd write a letter to the editor and hope that the organization would respond at some point. I mean, that doesn't happen anymore. It's, you know, everybody is online. Everybody's a PR person. And it has to be, you know, people complain at that moment. Somebody has to respond. You know, so we've helped organizations to build that capacity. We represent a number of organizations in that capacity where we handle social media for them. So the changes in 20 years have been huge. You know, we do a lot of work outside of Kenya, right across, you know, the African continent. And again, you know, people look at Africa like it's this one. It's not. You can't have one African solution. Different markets, you know, and some markets are more developed than others. South Africa's, you know, very developed. Kenya's developed. Nigeria's getting there. But there are some places where, you know, people are still huddled around a newspaper, sharing that one newspaper, and so it's different markets. So we've become, you know, the go-to company, I think, if you want a PR solution that is custom made for you.
And you talked about the digital coming on board and everyone becoming a PR person. How do you drive your agenda or your narrative when we have social media where everyone can say what they feel they should say about your client, for instance?
Well, I think, you know, what we've had to educate our clients as well, because I think social media is quite scary, you know, especially for sort of multinationals that are very used to just, you know, not saying anything. And suddenly they're realizing that if they're not in that space, somebody will be telling their story for them. And I think, you know, you can't have everybody else setting the agenda if you're not going to respond. So, you know, a lot of our work has been training our own clients about the need to be active on social media. And I think, you know, we've been successful in that. I mean, you see now that most corporates are, you know, have a Facebook, Twitter. I mean, they're in that space. And it's really, really important. I keep sort of saying to them, if you're not in that space, you know, somebody else will be telling your narrative. And that's always really dangerous.
A while back you rebranded from Gina Din Corporate Relations to now Gina Din Group. What is in this group? Do we have more things in the basket now?
So, you know, the Gina Din Group really was so that we could now go across the continent. You know, the sort of Gina Din Corporate Communications was quite, you know, it was quite narrow. And I think the group now is able to offer, you know, many more products across the continent. I mean, different countries require different solutions. And I just felt that having a group that could bring in different skills was going to be important, which is why we rebranded.
And I want to talk about these 130 awards. I mean, I know it's a lot of hard work that goes into this, but what does it mean for your team? I understand it's been growing as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're the most awarded company in the PR space in Africa, and I think it's just been a lot of hard work by the team. And I have the most incredible team that, you know, put in a lot of work to win these awards. You know, we do great work across the continent, and I think the awards are a way of being recognized globally. And we've won a lot of awards, you know, in Kenya, and I think that's great. But really, our space, you know, our playground is Africa, and so for us to not only showcase what we do, but to showcase to the world what Africa can do. I was in Barcelona last week when I won the 2 Stevie Awards, and you know, the interview was actually, you know, how good is this for your company? And I said, it's great, but it's actually really important for the continent that Africa can compete on a global stage, and that for me is what's important. The African agenda is very, very, you know, it's very important to me, and as 20 years has gone by, I think that's, you know, shaping African conversations is really where we want to go. Because if we don't take charge of our own story as Africans, then somebody else is going to be telling our story.
And how different is it when you tell these stories from country to country in Africa? Do you have different experiences, especially looking at the growth across those 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. You know, like I said, some markets are much more developed and they get it. In some countries you go and they'll be like, oh, no, you know, we want publicity. You know, which is very different to PR, and that's not, you know, so I think people have different perceptions, and you know, it's interesting that we're in the in the world of perceptions, and the PR industry's perception is probably the most misunderstood. So trying to explain to people what is PR is a big part of what we do.
Let's talk about the African conversations. You have this agenda going on, shaping African conversations. How easy is it? Because looking at it from a global point of view, most of the bad stories, so to say, come from Africa.
Well, I think the problem that we have is that Western media, tend to portray Africa in terms of conflict, corruption, the kids with the distended bellies and famine and all that. And that really makes me sad because we have such great success stories on this continent, and yet they're never highlighted. But it's because we don't tell our stories. And I think that's, I think that's the problem, and that's really what my drive is, and that's where my focus is going to be. Having been here for 20 years, it's our responsibility to now change the narrative of Africa, and Africans have to do it. And so I keep talking to people right across the continent. The success stories are just incredible. We have such amazing success stories on this continent, and we never hear them. And I think the other problem just within Africa is because we take a lot of the news from the news wires, and so we regurgitate that story that has come out from wherever it's come out from, and we and that's the problem. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be telling our own stories and not be taking stuff off international wires.
At the end of the day, though, these people still get that story and tell it. So how do we make sure that as governments, as private sector, there's actually that positive story is coming out? Because we can tell, but they'll also come and they'll tell the same stories as well.
I think that's why I think the PR industry in Africa is there's so much room for growth. It's because suddenly people are realizing reputation is so important. Governments are realizing that reputation is key if they're going to get investors in. That successes of their countries are really important to get foreign investment. So the PR industry is growing just because people are starting to see the benefit of it. And it's a double-edged sword. Some countries use PR in a very negative way, and they're sort of much more spin doctors as opposed to PR. But real good, strong, strategic communication partners are in demand in Africa, and I think that's the space that we're playing in.
All right. I'd like to put a pause there as we just take a short break. When we come back, we'll still be with Gina Din-Kariuki, just looking at the PR industry in Africa and where we are going. Don't go too far. Welcome back to Captains of Industry. We are still in Nairobi talking to Gina Din-Kariuki, who is the executive chair of Gina Din Group. Thank you so much again for staying with us. Now, we talked about shaping African conversations, how important PR is in this continent, in the times that we are living in Africa right now. But what does the future of PR look like for you?
Well, the PR industry as a whole, and I'll talk on behalf of the industry, not just my own organization. I think the future, the growth is here. The PR frontier, the next PR frontier is definitely Africa. Don't forget, out of the 10 world's fastest growing economies, a number of them are on this continent. So it just, it follows that, their communications and their reputations, are very, very important. And I think international companies that are coming onto the continent are realizing that, what their story is important. So I think there's huge opportunities for PR companies. We're seeing a lot of the international companies coming onto the continent and growing their footprint here. And that's great because it gives clients a bigger choice. But I think it's also important that, local knowledge, is harnessed. And I think the international companies that are coming onto the continent are, having affiliates and making sure that they do get, the local, because it cannot be the same solution that they would offer in India or in Bangkok or in New York. It's not. Kenya is complex. Other countries on the continent are complex, and they're very, we've got cultural issues. There's just so many different issues that, unless you're an African, you won't get it. So I think I think the future is, we're seeing a lot more of that. I think a big part of the problem is skills across the continent, and that is the problem. We're lucky here to have universities that offer PR, but not very many African countries are offering PR at a university level. And so I think, the talent pool is something that is going to be a challenge. But, we're doing whatever we can to train. And wherever we go on the continent, we try and build capacity in those countries.
Talking about skills, I mean, in other careers where we are not short of talent in this country and across Africa, there's been this disconnect between academia and industry. For the people already that are in the industry as we speak, do you find that whereby now you have to invest in training? You mentioned about that.
So I think, yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of, students that come straight to us from university, and I think it's great because they get, they have the technical knowledge, they know how to, but I think until you get your hands dirty, until you're actually part of an organization that's working 14 hours a day, and it's hard work. I think, the PR industry is sort of seen as quite glamorous, and, it's actually not. It's actually really unsexy, quite inconvenient, and, at times it's really tedious. I think, we're getting people that come in and then suddenly have like, oh, I don't really want to do this because they haven't really had the experience. So I think universities are great to set a baseline, but I don't think there's anything like actually coming and being part of an organization. And I know a lot of the PR companies that are coming onto the continent are offering training. There's, the intranets that people are able to go to and get information on different aspects of PR. Because, we look at PR, it's huge. I mean, what is, stakeholder relations? And I think that's a big part of PR in Africa is the stakeholder relations part, and trying to be the bridge between governments and clients. And I think, so there's a skill required there. And that's not necessarily a skill that's taught at university.
Yeah, you mentioned about the growth that African continent is experiencing now. If you look at it, it's higher than other regions in the world. But when these companies come here, are they keen to work with Gina Din, to work with local PR specialists, just to try and push your story, not just out there, but just getting that acceptance and good reputation in the continent?
I think it's quite difficult for them because they're used to being handled by one of the big 5 companies that out of London or New York or whatever. So I think, they come into a country and suddenly, and Michael Joseph, who came here to start Safaricom, will say this. He came to us and he was like, what the hell is this small company, going to do for us? But I think what's happening is that, realizing local knowledge is so important when you're starting out in a country, that you'll need somebody that knows the nuances, and the larger international companies might not know that. But I think what is encouraging is to see that the local companies are affiliating now with the international companies. So I think happy marriages are happening.
Yeah. I mean, you have guys like MBA Africa. How much convincing do you have to get such kind of brands on your team or on your portfolio?
Well, I love what MBA Africa does. So I'm very passionate about the work they do with the youth of this continent, because I think that's going to be either, a huge opportunity for the continent, or it's going to be a huge problem. And MBA Africa, to me, really mirrors my own ethos and my own values. And so I was very keen to work with them just because of their youth agenda. And it's not even about the game, but it's the life skills that they're teaching the youth right across the continent, which really excites me. And so, I got to know them. We've done a little bit of work for them, but, I'm very passionate about doing whatever I can to support organizations who have, this sort of value system. Because I think that's, at the end of the day, after being here for 20 years, it's really where are we going as a continent, and how are we going to shape the narrative of Africa, which is really keen. And NBA does that extremely well. The NBA African players who come back onto the continent and who give so much to their countries just really inspire me. I mean, I spend time with them, and they are absolutely incredible individuals. And I think sometimes in Africa we look at leadership, and the first thing that comes to our mind is political leadership. And yet there's so many different types of leadership, and for me, the NBA players from Africa are just absolutely incredible leaders. And so it's for me, it's very refreshing.
Let's talk about those politicians and politics for a moment. I mean, we know the point where as Kenya we are today. How do you even start shaping a positive narrative about Africa, or about Kenya specifically, when we are in an election crisis, if you'd like so, and many other African countries? Basically, the politics, especially when we talk about transitioning from one government to another, it's always a challenge, and we've seen that affecting economic growth of many countries.
Yeah, I mean, I think, sort of political messaging, is something that one must take very seriously. It's a huge responsibility. It's a huge responsibility, that the politicians have to realize that whatever messages that they put out there affects millions and millions of people. And that's really, where social media can be so damaging, because, you know, in this era of fake news, I mean, you don't even know, you never know anymore whether what you're reading is true or not. And it, you know, and people respond to this kind of stuff, and it can end up being really, really dangerous. I think, you know, Africa is sort of seeing the importance of having strong political messaging. I still don't think it's handled in a responsible way. I'm hoping that, you know, in future that will be important, that, you know, transparency and accountability, that politicians must communicate, you know, the truth, I think is key. Kenya, you know, I think it doesn't benefit anybody to, you know, to have a polarized country. So, you know, I'm really hoping that at some point there will be some, you know, that there will be some sense that prevails, because it's not good for business, not good for economy. But, you know, we just have to, you know, hope and pray that, you know, that we will get out of this. I think as a country we've been through so much, you know, and I know that, you know, the Kenyans will come through this and will come out stronger. But, you know, in terms of PR, Africa really needs to have good, strong reputations, because we've always been the dark continent. And, you know, we have this opportunity now where we can actually change that narrative, and, you know, we can make people want to come and invest in this continent. And it shouldn't be about bad elections. It should be about some of the very positive stories that we have.
Mm-hmm. Have you been able to bring out some of those stories? I mean, because you've been involved in peace initiatives in Kenya, 2007 and 8, 2013.
Yeah, so, you know, I mean, as an organization, we tend to keep talking about success stories, you know, about what the positive stories are about the continent. And it's something that we want to do, we want to continue to do. And, you know, we think it's a responsibility of every African to actually talk about the success of this continent. You know, it's our responsibility. We have to change that. Nobody's going to change it for us. The responsibility lies squarely on our shoulders.
Right, and talking about shaping African conversations, we've seen the work online, on YouTube and all, talking to great business people in the country. Are you going beyond that, just to try and see how you widen the scope, how you bring a positive narrative out of Kenya or East Africa, for instance? Well,
I think, you know, digital and YouTube is great because you can reach so many people. But I do make an attempt, you know, every time I travel, and I travel very widely across the continent and across, you know, around the world, to actually keep talking about the African narrative and about, you know, in groups of people, and, you know, telling them things that they didn't even know happened, you know, success stories about this continent. And we've got Wangari Maathai, we've got M-Pesa, we've got, you know, Barack Obama, you know, we consider as our son. We've got so many great success stories. And, you know, every place that I go, I do try and talk about it, just to try and, you know, change people's perception, because I think that's what it is. It's what is the perception out there in Africa, you know, and how do we go about changing that perception?
Mm-hmm. I want to get back to Gina Din, and I want to know, what are you doing? What's next? What's the next phase of growth, expanding horizon across Africa? How do you see your strategy in the medium to long term?
Well, I think we're in a lucky position in that, you know, we've done so much. We've probably handled 80% of corporate Kenya. And we were doing everything for them, you know, from events to, you know, brand activations, and, you know, the whole menu that you could offer. I think we're quite, you know, much more selective in terms of what we want to do. And I think we're seen now very much as not only a PR company, but as a strategic communications consulting company. And I think that's the exciting space to be in. So that would be, you know, talking to, you know, working with organizations, not just for media, but looking at their internal communications, and that everything that they have around communications. So really, for me, that's the space that we want to be in, is not purely PR, but being much more of a management consulting company. And I think that's where PR is going to go. You know, if you look at, you know, a lot of the big companies, you know, they do management consulting really well. They don't communicate that very well. And I think they're realizing that communications is a big part of management consulting. So I think, you know, there's going to be, very soon the lines are going to be quite blurred between PR organizations and management consulting. And so we want to lead that space.
Mm-hmm. Before we close, what has been the biggest challenge for you growing this business?
I think the biggest challenge for me has been trying to explain to people what we do. You know, PR was just like, I said, what is that? Isn't that the same thing as advertising? You know, so are you a spin doctor? You know, all these things that, you know, so I think for me the biggest challenge is trying to actually build an industry on this continent, getting people to understand what the PR industry is about. So, we've built a great brand over 20 years, but I think, hopefully one day when history on PR in this continent is written, I'll have a small line that we contributed to letting people know what this industry actually does.
Or a paragraph.
I hope, or a chapter. That's really what I see as going forward for me.
Right. Thank you so much for speaking to us. And that has been Gina Din-Kariuki, Executive Director of Gina Din Communications Group right here in Kenya. Just talking about the PR industry in Kenya and Africa and where we are going as a continent. Thank you for watching Captains of Industry.